Our first panelist, Kris Hamel, who is a Workers' World Party member and the editor of the paper as well, and Moratorium Now Coalition member. So Kris,
Thank you.
Could you speak into the mic?
Microphone. Oh, yeah,
We
microphone.
want to make sure this is recorded well.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
thanks.
Okay. Now, good afternoon, comrades and friends. First, I want to make sure that everybody knows that we have, Workers' World Party has a weekly newspaper, not only online at workers.org, but in print on a weekly basis. It's Workers' World newspaper. We have some ad copies on that table right over there. Hopefully the new paper will be coming this afternoon and be available to us. But in this paper, you find not only articles about the struggles going on here in the United States, but internationally as well. And you will find many articles about the struggles here in Detroit, including the struggle against the emergency manager, against the austerity plans, against the water shutoffs, all the struggles that we're involved in. Really, the paper is what unifies our party and gives us a weekly voice, not only here in this country, but internationally. So please pick up a paper. You can also subscribe to a daily thing online that you get your articles sent right to your smartphone or your computer. I also want to welcome back today Comrade Tashe. She had a very serious surgery, but I guess she's back here in less than 2 weeks. All right. Okay, I was asked to speak about the reproductive rights and the struggle for women's equality. And ever since I was asked, I've been thinking about this a lot. And I realized that I can't confine myself to the question of reproductive rights, because really they're a microcosm of the rights that women have or don't have in general under capitalist society. And women's rights are also used as a political football by the ruling class, which I'll discuss a little bit more coming up. Now, one thing, a slogan that's been that's becoming more and more prominent in the reproductive rights movement is the question of reproductive justice. Because you can't just have reproductive rights. You need to, you have to start with rights in order to have reproductive freedom. But you can't have reproductive freedom unless you also have reproductive justice. And what does that mean? That means that you have the right to decide not only if you want to carry a child to term or not by abortion, which our party has always supported the demand of free and accessible abortion on demand for all women, but also the right to have children and to raise them with all the necessities of life that are needed for that process, and that we've heard today are so under attack in so many ways. Last weekend in Chicago, there was a Food is a Right People's Assembly. So many people don't have enough to eat. There's the water situation here in Detroit. How can you be a woman and have reproductive rights, let alone reproductive freedom or justice, when you have no running water in your home, when you can't even provide the basics of, the basics for life for your family? Now, what I want to ask, though, what I want to do is expand a little bit and see and raise the question, especially in this country with so much racism, as comrades have described already regarding the racist violence going on in Ferguson, Missouri, and the very righteous rebellion against the police, against the entrenched and systemic racism that exists. But I think of Michael Brown's mother. How is there any justice for her right now?
That's right.
How is there justice for the mother of Eric Garner, who was shot down? It was choked to death, rather, on Staten Island in New York City. How is there justice for the women and families of the over 1 million people that have been immigrants who have been deported from the United States since Obama became president? How is there justice of any kind for the mothers of the 50 or 60, at least 1,000 migrant children who are on the border and who are of the U.S. and Mexico and who are being shuttled off to all kinds of facilities around the U.S., often with racists welcoming them. And the children are coming from countries that are suffering the effects not only of U.S. policy militarily in their countries over decades of time, but also economic policies in Central America. One of the few countries where the children are not coming from is Nicaragua, which is providing, the Sandinista government there has been providing a lot of the human needs that children and all people need, and so we're not seeing an influx from that country like we are from so many of the others. The other question I ask myself is, well, how can there be any freedom or justice for lesbians and for trans women who are often the victims of the most brutal attacks? We saw the case a couple years ago of Cece McDonald in Minnesota, who fought back, and we defended her right to fight back against a racist, anti-transgender, really, they were fascistic people. When the guy had a swastika on him, she defended herself, and the guy with the swastika lay dead. Well, he wasn't, it wasn't these racists in this mob that set upon Cece McDonald and her friends that got arrested. It was Cece McDonald that got arrested. And it was in part because of a national and international campaign that really Workers' World Party helped to initiate by our support right away for Cece, for her right to self-defense, demanding that the charges be dropped, that got her really, instead of receiving up to, possible a life sentence, she was only sentenced to 3 years in prison. We said that's 3 years too much. She had time off for what she had already served, and she got out early. But it was an example that when oppressed people fight back, you can survive. You can garner solidarity and support. You have the right to fight back, and when you do, the forces, whether socialists, progressives around the country and around the world, will come to you with solidarity and assistance. Now, I also think of all the really millions of women who are victims or survivors of domestic violence, many of whom have been killed. A woman is more likely to be killed by their spouse than by anybody else, even by cops in this society, as well as the sexual violence that women face on a daily basis. Not only physical violence, but verbal harassment, things of this type. Now, there's one person who I want to mention who also defended herself against an abusive former spouse, and the tables were turned on her like they were on Cece McDonald. And that is Marissa Alexander down in Florida. Now, all she did was fire a warning shot into the ceiling of her home as her estranged spouse set upon her. He wasn't arrested. If he was, nothing happened about it. But she was arrested. And she was charged with 3 counts. The prosecutor is the same prosecutor that unsuccessfully prosecuted George Zimmerman in the trial of his killing of unarmed Trayvon Martin in 2012. And what happened essentially was because of the struggle, because of demonstrations all around the United States, Marissa Alexander was granted a new trial. That trial was supposed to start in July. It's been put off now until December 1st. A ruling came out by the judge at the end of July, which said that she cannot use the stand your ground law as a defense in her case, like George Zimmerman was able to do in his when he gunned down Trayvon Martin. Also, Marissa Alexander, now those 3 charges, instead of the prosecutor going after them, as a package altogether, they want to try her on each count so that if she's convicted, she has to serve concurrent sentences. Sequential sentences, and she's facing up to 60 years in prison. So hopefully this coming fall we'll see a galvanized struggle again to free Marissa Alexander, to get the charges dropped, and to put pressure on the prosecutor and the powers that be in Florida, just like we did with Cece McDonald, so that one of the best possible outcomes can happen for Marissa Alexander, who, by the way, is African American, just like Cece McDonald is, just like Michael Brown, all these victims of oppression. And you really can't separate out the sexism from the racism, because racism, is built into the very foundation of this country, as well as sexism being deeply embedded in society as a whole. Now, one of the things that in Workers' World Party slogan that we like to say is that every issue is a woman's issue, which is true, and every struggle has women participants, has or should have women in leadership, being spokespeople, being on the front lines for fighting for people's justice, whatever that is. And we saw that here in Detroit very much with the Moratorium Now Coalition. How many women were affected by these foreclosures and the devastations of neighborhoods? How many senior women were targeted by the banks? Women who had very fixed incomes and that were set upon by the banks. And right now you see the results of that by going through practically any neighborhood in Detroit. They haven't really started the blight removal yet. So the consequences of the foreclosure crisis are very, very clear throughout the city. Now, every year when it comes to reproductive rights, every year in the states, there are literally hundreds, if not over 1,000 bills or measures raised in state legislatures around the country. And there's the Center for, what's the name of it? One of the groupings keeps track of these pieces of legislation. One year it was like 800 and something bills. I think last year it was over 1,000. And they're regarding a whole host of things meant to whittle down Roe versus Wade, which was the Supreme Court decision in 1973 that was really wrested from a reactionary Nixon-appointed Supreme Court because of the mass struggle, not only of women, but black people, Latinos, the American Indian movement, the great social upheavals that took place here in the U.S. in the late 60s and 70s. So these bills have to do with everything from, making the abortion facilities have all these requirements. The hallway has to be a certain width. The light bulbs have to be such and so. Just ridiculous measures meant to shut down clinics, meant to further erode the ability of women to exercise their right to an abortion. A lot of the things they have, and some of them are in Michigan now, showing women pictures of their fetus, sonograms, or making you listen to a heartbeat, or making you listen to some unscientific, non-medical statement that abortion will hurt you physically and emotionally and psychologically, and that many people consider it murder, all this type of thing that women have to endure. Also, waiting period. Do you want an abortion? Well, you go home for 48 hours and you think about it, and then you can come back and have one. Now, while these hundreds of bills every single year in state legislatures throughout the U.S. Happen, and they get fought off, and a lot of them get defeated, there's not one bill anywhere that regulates male bodies, okay? So it helps to keep that in mind when you think of the hundreds and more than 1,000 of pieces of legislation that try and control women and women's reproduction. Now, one thing that I want to raise is that the struggle for abortion rights has really been used as a political football by the ruling class. For many years, for example, in the 1960s, the Republican Party supported a woman's right to choose. And it was really in the early, it was after Roe versus Wade, and during the Carter administration, who, by the way, Carter signed the Hyde Amendment, which meant that women receiving federal funds could not utilize them for abortions. So this idea that somehow Democrats are better than Republicans when it comes to women's issues is totally false, and we should remember that. And showing the utter hypocrisy of this, in 2009, this woman, Jennifer Nadeau, wrote an article that indicated, it was called "Low Income Women Can't Get Abortions, but RNC Staffers Can." And it stated that the staffers of the Republican National Committee have had abortion covered under their insurance plan since at least 1991. So while they want to take away rights from especially the poorest and most vulnerable women, it's okay for them to say that out of one side of their mouth, but go ahead and have that coverage, out of the other side of their mouth. Now, I see a lot of people are falling asleep, and I hope I'm not, it's a long day.
It's after lunch.
Kind of
It's after lunch.
Yes, the time, I can do that. Okay, so I don't want to go on for too much longer, but I want to raise that there have been 3 terrible Supreme Court rulings, 2 especially, but I'm going to count another one too, that have come down by the latest Supreme Court this past spring. One had to do with the company, and we wrote about this in Workers' World. You can, Google it and find our articles. The one had to do with the company called Hobby Lobby. And I'd never even heard of this thing. And Jerry and I were at a state park up by Port Huron, and we drove by one of them. And I'm like, oh my God, there's Hobby Lobbies. And she's like, what? And I'm like, it's the place, But what, the Supreme Court previously stated that corporations are persons, right? Mm-hmm. Well, they're not just persons, they're persons who can have religious views. Mm-hmm. And if your religious views aren't in line with theirs, then you don't qualify to get contraception. So essentially, there are 4 types of birth control that Hobby Lobby said they were abortion causing, and that they refuse to pay for, because under Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, contraception is supposed to be free and available to all women. So that effectively challenges not only the ACA on the questions of reproductive rights for women, but also raises other potential problems that, an employer can have whatever kind of religious views and deny whatever they want to their workers. Also, in Massachusetts, and this was another infamous ruling this spring, the court overturned the Massachusetts law, which said there had to be a buffer zone outside abortion clinics for the right-wingers, for the anti-choice protesters, the people that come there with their signs of aborted fetuses and try and talk women, supposedly talk them out of having an abortion. So while the Supreme Court that has their own buffer zone around them, like all federal officials do, they got rid of that for abortion in clinics. And basically, a woman trying to utilize a Planned Parenthood clinic for whatever reason, doesn't have anything to do with abortion necessarily. You can be accosted right there at the door when you're trying to go in, and that's been ruled legal by the Supreme Court. Another terrible ruling that came down that very much affects women is that the court said that domestic workers in the state of Illinois do not have the right to unionize and collectively bargain. So that is a blow against the poorest women who are usually in the most oppressed women who are usually very often domestic workers. No union organizing for you. Now, Workers' World Party here in Detroit, we don't just pay lip service to the struggle for women's rights and the struggle for women's equality and for reproductive rights, freedom, and justice, but we participate in that struggle as well. For example, in June, National Men's Rights Advocates Conference was going to take place here in Detroit, downtown at the DoubleTree Hotel. And really, some independent women through social media having a protest to stop this from happening. And there was a march of 200 or 300 people on the DoubleTree Hotel. It was joined by workers from SEIU who are trying to organize the hotel workers. So it brought in low-wage workers and unionists. But essentially, it stopped them from having their conference. They ended up having it at a VFW hall in St. Clair Shores, and only about 30 people showed up. So it was very good to see a really militant action. It took the street. The cops were confounded. They didn't know what to do. They pleaded with us to get out of the street. We just ignored them. And it shows what militant, action can do. Also, several years ago, in 2006, when a law in South Dakota was put on the ballot that would have outlawed all abortions in that state, really galvanized, the movement across the U.S. In support of women in South Dakota. And at that time, we started up the Detroit Action Network for Reproductive Rights, called DANFOR, its acronym. And we helped with clinic defenses. We picketed one of these phony abortion centers. What are they called?
Alternatives to abortion.
Right. You think you're going to get help to get an abortion, and they try and talk you out of it, and they'll give you a week's supply of diapers for your baby, and really that's where it ends when it comes for concern for the children that are born and here by those people. We were very active for a couple of years, and then as the struggle sort of ebbed, and the struggle picked up around the foreclosure crisis, we saw the need, especially because so many women were impacted by the foreclosure crisis, to switch more of our work into that direction. Now, one of the things, the origins of women's oppression, we've studied many times here in Detroit, where we have bi-monthly classes where we read and discuss things. One of the items, one of the books which we read a good portion of was by Frederick Engels, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. And in that book, which another historical piece came out this was written in the 1800s, of course, and in 1971, I think it was, our founding comrade Dorothy Ballin took the concepts laid out by Frederick Engels, who was Marx's collaborator, into a then popular pamphlet, Feminism and Marxism. Unfortunately, this is also very dated because the struggles and issues and things that were going on back then have very much changed in the 40-some years that have occurred since. But one of the basic, what's that? I have 2 minutes? Oh my God, all right. One of the basic formulations from Engels' book, which was based on many archaeological and anthropological studies by Morgan, was the fact that women's oppression has not always existed. For the majority of human existence, society has been organized around women. It was known where children came from. The role of the mother was not known so much the role of the father in reproduction. And society functioned where there may have been some different divisions of labor, but everyone worked together cooperatively for the good of the whole. Women were held in high esteem, and it was only with the accumulation of surplus when the productive forces changed and people were able to accumulate more when it comes to things like cattle and the different animals, agriculturally accumulating excess more than was needed for the group. At this time, historically speaking, it was what Engels called the world historic defeat of the female sex. Because at that time, the men became dominant. They wanted all this wealth, the newly accumulated wealth, to pass on to their heirs. And we know the situation since then. I mean, every woman in this room can tell stories of what women's oppression is and that type of thing. So after, and this theory or this viewpoint of what caused, what was at the root of women's oppression also held true, and Comrade Susan will be speaking about 2 years after feminism and Marxism. We put out the book. It was first called The Gay Question, and it's been updated, The Roots of Gay and Lesbian Oppression. Then in 1996, Comrade Leslie Feinberg updated it with historical research for transgender warriors. So not only for women, but for LGBTQ people, the past was very different. And it shows that unlike what the capitalists want us to believe, that this is how things are, they've always been this way, they're always going to be this way, we know that society, based on changes in production, can change. So I just wanted to read a short thing that'll give a little bit, put a little this, what I'm talking about, into perspective regarding our view on the struggle of women. And that was the editorial for International Women's Day, which is March 8th every year. It was started by socialist women back in 1910. And this, I just want to read parts of it. This year, meaning now, we see women fighting back against the ravages of corporate globalization on every continent, whether they work in Indonesia's factories, Bangladesh's garment industry, Greece's public sector, Haiti's clothing plants, or Brazil's agricultural fields. Women are demanding their rights. It is the economic crisis is propelling even more aggression abroad, but this is not opposed from the Philippines to Pakistan, from Somalia to Honduras to Gaza. Women challenge U.S. engineered coups, bases, troops, and weapons. It is capitalism, a system based on the private ownership of property, that lies at the crux of women's oppression and other forms of discrimination, inequality, and bigotry. Financial and social inequality are inherent within this system. The rich are getting richer, and the poor and the workers are getting poorer, and this income gap is widening on a world scale. The global capitalists pay the lowest wages possible in the factories and sweatshops where millions of women work. Women and girls are 70% of the world's poorest people. The economic crisis has worsened their conditions. Some 81 million are jobless. Millions are part-time and low-wage jobs. Millions have to migrate globally to find jobs, and then they face bigotry and mistreatment. And the same goes for here in the United States, the wealthiest country in the world, where there's no pay equity, where black women, African American women, Latina and Native women are paid even less than white women. And women are toiling, for instance, in the fast food sector, but fighting back nationally, or throughout the United States rather, for a higher minimum wage. So women have always fought back against exploitation and oppression, and will continue to do so, and will continue to link our struggles to the fight against racism and the fight for the liberation of all the workers and oppressed of the world.